This is Mary Skelter 2, a DRPG, dungeon RPG. DRPGs are a very specific niche subgenre, like subgenre of dungeon crawlers that are kind of just doing their own thing in their own corner of the games industry for a while, and they're honestly really fascinating, and I could probably dedicate an entire video just to the formation and history of the genre itself. But they're effectively, to keep it short, what happens when you combine classic dungeon crawler RPGs, like Wizardry for instance, with a JRPG. So they tend to have the battle tactics, first-person exploration, tile-based gameplay, front-on battles, and a lot of party building and things that classic dungeon crawlers, like the Wizardry series, brought to the table. And then the JRPG side means they often have like 80 billion different mechanics that all interact together, as well as quite nonsensical stories and a lot of very anime-ish characters. And I do have to admit right from the beginning that this game is a little bit too anime for me, I'll be totally real. That's often the case with a lot of DRPGs. I tend to find that these stories and characters are a little bit too anime for my taste, but I tend to enjoy them for the actual gameplay and the battles, you know, all the party building stuff. But this game is no exception to that. It is, I consider myself a bit of a weeb, I guess, I'll be honest, because, I do things like build Gundams to keep in my room because I like them and they're pretty, but I do have my limits, and this game definitely pushes past those limits a little bit. I'm not a fan of the, having your entire party be consisted of lollies and things like that. That doesn't really do it for me. It kind of freaks me out and makes me very uncomfortable, but I'm willing to push past the anime-ness to get to the pretty enjoyable gameplay. Whether or not you're able to is entirely up to you, but let's get into it. What exactly is Mary Skelter 2? Well, it's not actually a sequel to Mary Skelter 1, confusingly enough. It's not a prequel either. It's sort of a side story bit of events that could also potentially be happening. It's kind of complicated, as you would probably expect from JRPG storytelling, and going too deeply into it would be very spoiler territory, so I'm not going to do that. But the game does actually contain the remake of the first Mary Skelter Nightmares, which I did do a video of back in the day when it released on PC, and that's pretty cool. That means you get 2 games for 1 if you buy this. It's sort of a package deal, and it also does add some stuff to Nightmares, including a new ending that sort of ties the games together, which is an interesting concept, so it's a good thing that they included it, for sure. So the whole thing takes place in this sort of living dungeon called Jail, which is a fitting name because that's where I feel like I belong after playing this game for 12 hours. And it has a very fairy tale focused story. All of the areas have very fairy tale themings, the enemies are quite nightmarish and outlandish in general, and all of your characters are of course named after fairy tale main characters and princesses and the like, which lends the whole thing a very Alice in Wonderland mind trip weirdness kind of vibe to it that I really appreciate, and they do go full out with the creativity when it comes to the theming of the dungeons and stuff. They are very outlandish and weird. The enemy designs are even stranger than your usual JRPG fare. The boss designs are honestly quite horrifying at times, and the nightmares themselves, which we'll get onto later, are really scary. They're just super unsettling looking, and they do their job of being this implacable, horrifying thing really, really well. So the game definitely gets an A+ on its visual design because it is as trippy as the source material would imply it should be. Exploration is done from a first-person perspective in these very large labyrinthine levels. The levels of the dungeon themselves are all themed, and there's usually about 4 or 5 floors for each theme, each having its own set of enemies and eventual bosses, as well as its own nightmare. One thing I really like about how this game does its exploration is the areas themselves are actually very interactive. While exploring, you'll find all sorts of different things like different traps along the floor or along the walls that you have to either time to get through safely without your whole party taking damage, or just avoid by moving very quickly through them. There's also a ton of switches and various shortcuts and things that you can find that make the areas feel relatively dynamic, and the game does do a very good job of making the areas less tedious to go through after the first couple of times by allowing you to find and unlock various shortcuts from floor to floor that allow you to actually get around much faster later on, because every time you go back to base to heal up and stuff, you will have to restart that particular area from its first floor. So unlocking these various shortcuts is a very good idea, allowing you to traverse between the floors much faster. Each of the characters in your party also has a special ability that they can use to interact with the world in some way, from the magnetic piccolo that allows you to draw in boxes towards you to fill in gaps that you can cross, or to set on switches or things like that, and also allows you to remotely access chests and things that you otherwise couldn't physically walk up to, which is useful, To the teleportation bread, yes. It's basically a play on the Hansel and Gretel breadcrumbs thing, and it allows you to actually teleport. It's sort of like a mark and recall thing. You mark an area with and you can teleport back to where you marked, but you can also throw it like 3 squares forward, allowing you to cross gaps with it that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. So there's quite a bit of puzzling to be done in the individual areas, so not only are they very labyrinthine and just have a lot of floor space to them for you to uncover, which you will map out automatically tile by tile as you move, but there are also all these shortcuts to find and a whole number of hidden areas that you can come across and some other things of that nature that reward your exploration. And of course it does have JRPG style random encounters. The enemies are not on the map except for the ones that are, but most of the enemy encounters are not on the map visibly. So as you're exploring you will be assailed by monsters, so that brings us to the combat. The combat is where the mechanics start to layer together to become quite complex. If you've ever played something like Etrian Odyssey, that's another DRPG that seems to be a little bit more like mainstream popular, then you'll sort of know what to expect. Combat is a first-person affair where you do not actually see your party members except for in portraits, and you just face the enemies and beat them up. The game uses a sort of Final Fantasy Tactics-like job system where every different party member has a variety of 5 different jobs that they can be at any given time, although you do have to go back to town in order to change the jobs. And each job has a list of abilities that they can learn with job points that they gain from leveling up, so you can mix and match the various jobs' abilities to create a more powerful character. This is the main draw for me, because I love that sort of thing. I love job systems like this, and it's good at making each job feel different and impactful in their own ways with their own abilities to learn. And you'll be using your basic attacks and all these various abilities in combat to strike enemy weaknesses as much as possible, because striking weaknesses not only does more damage, but it also spills blood everywhere, and blood is a big mechanic in this game, weirdly enough. You also tend to splatter a lot of it for overkilling enemies, which happens pretty frequently. You might see those little splotches on the character portraits down there that represent blood drops. That is the blood gauge, and these fill up as you get covered in blood. This gauge has 3 different uses, and it's actually extremely important to gameplay to actually use them properly, because if you do not manage this gauge very well, you can actually destroy yourself in a very hard combat that will snowball quickly out of control, but using it well can make you just stomp bosses with no quarter, so it's very important to use it. For one, there's the lick button, because of course there is, and the lick button does exactly what you think and allows you to deplete this gauge, and every different character has a different buff that they impart on a character who does this, ranging from things like just a burst heal to protecting the entire party with a shield and things like that. These are quite important to use, but also for a different reason we'll get into in just a second. However, when this blood gauge fills up all the way and that character's turn comes up, they go into Massacre Mode. Massacre Mode is sort of like a sort of trance/limit break style idea. It transforms them physically and they get extreme buffs to their stats. Well, not extreme, but very high buffs to their stats. They become even more powerful than usual. They also gain access to their unique massacre skills, every character having different ones. These are super nice because not only do they tend to be very, very powerful, but they also usually cost very little SP to use, and SP is kind of at a premium in this game, so you have to be careful about how much of it you use. So a Massacre Mode character can very easily end an entire combat, even with a boss, quite effectively, and having them in this state is a good idea. However, there is a downside to this. You may see that some of those little blood splotch gauges at the bottom are actually darker than others. Some are bright pink, some are more of like a deep purple. That's because this represents corruption. As a character takes damage, their corruption builds up. It's sort of like frustration. And if they take a large burst of damage at once, it builds up even faster, as well as if one of the characters falls in combat, everyone else's corruption goes up by quite a large amount. If the corruption is too high when they enter Massacre Mode, they will instead go into something called Blood Skelter, which is very, very bad. Blood Skelter is sort of like a Berserk mode, where their stats get an even bigger boost than in Massacre Mode, but you completely lose control of them, and they will attack friend and foe alike. You really, ideally, do not want this to happen. It can be advantageous to you, but more often than not, your characters will end up healing the enemies and just destroying your entire party. It's a very bad thing to have happen, especially during boss fights and things, and this means that if characters keep dying and this corruption keeps building, then battles will often snowball in the enemy's favor, and you will just destroy yourselves and have to restart. So that's why using this mechanic well and going into Massacre Mode when it's appropriate, and then using that lick command to prevent them from going into Blood Skelter and things like that is very important. And just managing your character's blood gauges in general is a key part of the combat. You also have Jack in your party, who works a little bit differently. Your main character actually gets 2 actions per one of their turns because they also have Jack with them, so you can do 2 actions with your main character, 2 actions with Jack, or 1 with each. And Jack has a lot of useful things that he can do to sort of debuff enemies and buff the party. He can remove corruption from your party members, he can knock someone out of Blood Skelter, he can make enemies miss their turns, and some other useful things of that nature, but doing so will affect his mental state, and if his mental state gets too bad, he will transform into Nightmare Jack, which works very much like Blood Skelter, where you lose control of him and he just goes berserk and attacks everything. Also, if you get Nightmare Jack to happen 3 times in a single battle, you automatically game over. One thing that's new is the Blood Flower mechanic. You will get various crystals, blood crystals, from killing enemies, and these crystals are extremely useful. They're used for things like changing jobs, unlocking new jobs for your characters, as well as for upgrading your equipment. Your equipment can be +1 and +2'd up to fairly ludicrous levels. However, you can also choose to plant these as seeds in the ground at any place in the dungeons that you want, and there are also specified areas that have a sort of neon pink glow to them that will give you better rewards if you plant there. As you defeat enemies and spray blood all over the place, it will fertilize these flowers, and eventually they will be ready to harvest. And if you harvest them all at once, you get a big bonus to the possible amount of things that you can find, and this is actually the way that you get the best equipment that you can find. Weapons, armor, and accessories can be obtained from doing this, and they will be far in advance of things that you're finding in treasure chests or that you can buy from the shop. For instance, I found like incredibly powerful like +42 daggers that had inbuilt skills and gave me all sorts of resistances and things. It's just a very good way to make yourself stronger, and it's recommended that you do this as often as possible. You do need these crystals for other things, but it is absolutely worth planting some of them and harvesting them all at once in one big sort of loot fest. But of course there are even more mechanics than that. You can also find blood packs, which you have to have appraised, sort of like identifying them, and then you can transfuse these blood packs into your characters to teach them new skills. You can also find pieces of the jail itself that you can use to affect the sort of roulette minigame that plays when certain conditions are fulfilled. The jail has different needs, and you fulfill these needs in different ways. Sleep is gained just by doing actions without taking damage. You have another one that's gained from finding treasure and, opening chests and other like loot points and things like that, gathering points and all that sort of stuff. And then you also have hunger, which is sustained by spraying blood everywhere. And for each one of these you fill up, a little roulette wheel will pop up and allow you to stop it and obtain various different rewards. Some out of battle and some in battle. There are 2 different wheels on each area for each one, and you can actually use these jail pieces to slot into this wheel to guarantee certain rewards appear more than others if you want to find those. There are also jail challenges, which I happen to quite like, that allow you to increase the difficulty in various ways for extra rewards, like extra XP, extra gold, extra chance for better loot, and all sorts of different things like that. And there are a ton of different challenges for you to take on, from as simple as just enemies have better stats, to as punishing as you don't have a map or you can't save. And you can customize these challenges for each area at any time that you want when you're at the hub area before you go into a dungeon. DRPGs are generally known for being quite difficult. Etrian Odyssey, for instance, is an extremely unforgiving series. As far as this game's difficulty goes, I don't think it's as hard as something like Etrian Odyssey is, but it is relatively challenging. It actually is pretty difficult, and you really do need to pay attention to enemy weaknesses and to your blood gauges and stuff to not get stomped. There are also, of course, a lot of characters for you to collect and have in your party, and a ton of different events that you can view as you get characters to flesh out the story and the sort of affection of each character. You can even buy each of them gifts in order to see more of their personal stories. So that's Skelter 2 in a nutshell. I'm really just kind of scraping the surface of all the various mechanics that are in this game. There's a lot to it. Really, for $40, there's a lot of game here. It's quite a long experience, and the fact that it also includes the remake of the first one basically doubles the length of what you're getting for that price. So if you do like DRPGs, or if you're a fan of like old school Wizardry-style dungeon crawlers and you want some more of that, this is actually a pretty interesting game to take a look at if you can handle the very anime aesthetic and storyline that may rub some people the wrong way, which I totally understand, but I'm mostly here for the mechanics, to be honest, and the mechanics are pretty sound. It does a good job of stringing me along with relatively interesting nightmare designs, which, by the way, nightmares are invincible creatures that will hunt you throughout the areas if you find them, and you have to just run away from them to try and survive, because you can't kill them, but eventually you will reach the end of a dungeon and break the dungeon's core, which will allow you to actually fight the nightmare and finally destroy it as the final boss of that area before moving on. So these are your sort of crowning big boss fights, but before then, they are scary things that chase you around, and I actually like that you get to sort of have revenge on the scary thing that's been causing you problems this whole time, so that by the end you get to turn around and fight it for real. That's pretty cool. So yeah, that's Mary Skelter 2. It's a very heady experience with a lot of weirdness going on and a ton of mechanical complexity and variety when it comes to building your own party and choosing jobs and all the combat stuff. It's pretty fun, actually, as long as you can stomach how anime it is. So thank you guys very much for watching. I'll link you in the description to the Steam store page to this game, and do remember, of course, that you get both games when you buy it. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.